Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome to the first of a series of interviews where I'm going to be interviewing top producing mortgage and real estate professionals with Kristen Messerly, the executive director and co-founder of First Home IQ. But we're going to be doing a little bit of a slant, where we're interviewing people that have a really inspiring and compelling story themselves around how buying their home young, well, JJ Mazzo is not a Gen Z. He did buy his first home in his 20s. How old were you when you got your first home, JJ?
Yeah, I think I was about 20 years old.
Yeah, 20 years old. So, I mean, these stories will all have a couple of things in common. They did start young, so it's inspirational and something to really inspire the next generation. And then they're still in housing, whether they're mortgage professionals or real estate professionals. They've made a career out of this, which is something that I think will also be inspiring. Kristen, anything you want to say before we start hearing JJ's story?
No, I'm excited to hear about your story and, dig in a little bit on what you wish you'd known or, what kind of caused you to even decide you could buy a home at that age, but I'll let you tell the story.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one last frame before we ask JJ his story. This all happened at dinner. We were having dinner together at my friend Massimo's place, Anotria. Thank you, JJ. That was a great dinner together. And I almost want you to kind of just go back to that when you were telling me your story about buying young. You know, how did you buy young? What motivated you to buy young? Maybe even give a little bit of a backstory the year before you bought your first house. And then let's just kind of walk through the journey you've had and to where you're at today.
Yeah. So, first off, guys, I really appreciate you having me on here because I think sharing these stories is super important. I don't know that everyone has the same, I don't know, the same history, same background, same mindset around real estate because a lot of people, I think the generation that's there right now were born during the Great Recession. So I think there's a lot more fear around home ownership when you were either born or growing up in that environment, which I totally get. So I think sharing this is really important. I think my background to understand it better is how I was raised and brought up. My father was much older. He grew up during the Great Depression, and he was kind of a vagabond, so to speak. And so growing up, it was very much the same. We had a blended family, and we would live in, anything from different types of hotels to renting places pretty much my whole life. Probably lived in 14, 15 different homes or hotels and stuff throughout my whole life. I always joke that when my dad gave you his first and last month's rent, it's probably the first and last month's rent you'll ever see from my dad. That was pretty common. And so I think that knowing that was the big reason for me on one, getting into the real estate space, because my dad never thought he could qualify for a home because he was always self-employed. So he didn't think he could show the income to qualify. And he didn't have the down payment that he thought he needed to be able to buy a home. So those were just his negative self-talk or his truth, so to speak. So I just kind of went along with it most of my life. Now,
JJ, and not to, well, I did interrupt you,
it's
but I
okay.
mean, those are limiting beliefs that
Yeah.
millions of people have. Like, oh, I don't have enough down payment. Oh, I'm self-employed, so I can't qualify. So I just want to call out there,
Yeah.
guys, part of this movement is to eliminate that, like help people know what the truth is. Because I just had to call that out, bro.
No, and it's spot on, right? Because I didn't realize that until I got into the mortgage space. So as I graduated high school and immediately got into the mortgage space, and as I got into that space, I started realizing that there were solutions for these problems. And my father would know. He was in sales most of his life, furniture manufacturing, you name it, the guy did it, whether it was illegal or legal. That was just my pop. So kind of growing up with that, once I realized that and started learning these. I had some mentors. First, just getting into the mortgage space where I realized leveraging money and being able to buy real estate itself. And I had a real passion to help people with less than average credit because my father always was credit challenged. And I thought it sucked because I always tied it to the fact that we moved around all the time because we didn't own a home. So I really wanted to own a home so that I could have some stability in my life. And that's where I tied those two together. Ironically, I probably moved a lot since then, but that was my limiting belief, so to speak. And so learning that, I figured out how it is that I could leverage. I figured out my credit score was enough. I figured out what it is my debt to income ratio needed to be, meaning how much I made versus how much my debt burden was going to be. And then the hardest part was coming up with the down payment, which was at that time, the condo that I was purchasing was $138,000, and it was perfect. 2-bedroom, 2-bath condo. I had a little yard for my dog, attached garage. I mean, it was like perfect in the area I wanted to buy. So I had borrowed money from a family member, used that for my down payment, and was able to purchase that first home. Everything else came together. Now, although I qualified, I was still very nervous about making the payment. So there's something else that people are nervous about. So I had a roommate that was there that moved in immediately after I bought that place. So it really helped with that burden. Even though I could qualify, I just didn't want that stress. And so that allowed me to also just be able to breathe a little bit more. So finally had a place of my own. And then ironically from there was able to help my parents get their first condo in the same complex once they realized, oh my gosh, you can do this. And then once I realized how to do it, to help my parents get into a condo themselves, which was pretty cool. But yeah, I mean, that place, I paid $138 for it. My rate was 7.9. It was a 3-year arm with like a 5-year prepay. And I sold that condo for about $365,000, and then went on to buy my next property or my single family home from there. So it's just a great example of what you can use for a stepping stone too.
So, Krista, anything you want to ask or say at this point?
Yeah, I'm just curious. You talked about, I mean, there were lots of anxieties that you had along the way. One being that, you know, you're coming from a background where you moved around a lot. So there's some element of, you know, addressing that anxiety through homeownership and accessing stability. Then you're looking at some of the, you know, you're having to get the information yourself around what it takes to buy a home and how to access that money, getting the gift or the loan, from a family member for the down payment, all of that. Is there anything along the way that you're like, man, I wish I had known this when I started, or I wish people would understand this? You know, I think just for a little bit more context, Gen Z might not today have the exact same, or every individual is going to have their own barriers. But I think that the more that people get awareness around what some of those barriers are, the less scary they are, you know, if that makes sense. So
yeah, 100%. I think for me, my biggest fear was being broke and being old with no money, which was my parents. You know, my parents were older, they had nothing. And realizing that, you know, 3 to 5, you know, on a $138,000 condo, I could make 5% plus a year off of that asset with not having to put down a penny of my own money. When I realized that, it solved my biggest fear, which was being broke and not having any money to be able to put a roof over my head or food in my mouth, because I wasn't always able to count on my parents for that. So I think people just have to weigh what their fears are. And, you know, and for me, that was a bigger fear, to just go head in and just give it a shot. And worst case scenario, I figured too, like if I can't make my mortgage payment, what's the difference if I can't make my rent payment? Either way, I'm going to be kicked out, right?
yep.
So I know how this story is going to play out. So I want to say a couple things before we go to the next step, because for any mortgage professionals listening to this, you know, first of all, many of you know who JJ Mazzo is. I mean, if there was a hall of fame in the mortgage industry, you know, JJ has really reached a level of success. He's created generational wealth, not only because he makes a lot of money as a mortgage professional and he leads, you know, a large region of other loan officers, but he's going to unpack a story where he sold that house, he bought another house, sold that house, bought another house. And I'm not even going to let him say out loud, you know, what the value of the house he lives in. Although, JJ, I do want to land on, you know, just the whole story of where you are today. But before I do that, you know, if there's a Gen Z that's listening to this right now, and they're like, yeah, but you were able to get your first house for $130,000, and, you know, you bought your house, you know, 20 years ago, and all this appreciation has taken place. And now we're in you know, an affordability crisis that it's not the same as when you were 20 years old. So I want you to speak into the Gen Z, the person that's, 20 years old, 25 years old, and tell them how, yeah, I know it's a little different than when I did it, but if you wouldn't mind speaking to them.
Yeah, the one thing I realized, and so that was my dad's excuse as well. And so I went and looked back at my dad's house that he was renting when I was born. He could have bought that house for about $30,000. That house today is worth about 1.8 million. And so when I started realizing, and when I bought that house, my first house, I looked at his house that was 30,000 and saw at that time it was worth 600. And so what I realized is it's not going to get, I mean, it's an appreciating asset when you look at it historically. Yeah, it has its ups and downs, but historically over time, it's just going to go up. So the longer you wait, the harder it gets. And, yes, I was able to buy it for a lot less money, but I made a lot less money. I think at that time I was maybe making $36,000 to $42,000 a year, all in gross taxable income. So it was a much different place. My first mortgage job was $1,500 a month and $20 a file as a loan assistant. So, it's not these numbers that you could necessarily make today in the mortgage business. So it's all relative. Inflation has a big part of that. So as the home prices have gone up, and we're seeing inflation being a big part of that now, so does everything else. So do wages, and so on and so forth. So I think it's all relative when you really look at it. And luckily now, you're not going to really be able to buy a home you can't afford due to debt to income ratio restrictions, like we could back then.
Yeah. So I'm going to say one thing, and then Kristen, well, first of all, let me say the one thing. So for anyone that just heard that debt restriction, so back in the day, in the early days, you used to be able to put whatever you wanted on the income. And now there's just a tremendous amount of diligence to make sure that you're buying a home that you can afford. People can't buy homes unless they can achieve sustainable home ownership for the most part. Now, Kristen, you've interviewed a lot of, Gen Z, people that are in that situation. And people, you did buy a home. Well, you've bought 2 homes now. But you've had these emotions personally, and then you also are really close to what's going through the head of Gen Z. Now, JJ gave us an answer, but I almost want you to push him a little bit. Like what would a skeptical Gen Z say to what he just said just now?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So first of all, I mean, we know the median down payment has increased by 72% just since 2020. And so saving for a down payment, even just in the last couple of years, has become incredibly, I mean, we all know on this call, it's so much more difficult. And I think the kinds of content I see on Instagram and TikTok, and the kinds of things that Gen Z are telling me are like, this is a joke. Like, homeownership is completely out of reach for me. Saving for a down payment feels like, it's out of reach. I'm curious, and what Dave said earlier, you do hear a lot of times about how home sale prices and values have increased so exponentially that this isn't possible to stay consistent, and I'm curious how you respond to that. One, to how you save for something like that, or how you respond to someone who's so skeptical, feels that this is out of reach. And then secondly, how you respond to someone feeling that we've kind of missed the boat in terms of experiencing that home appreciation.
Well, I mean, those are all fair questions. I think that the biggest thing is you have to look at the math and the data. I think there's too much feelings going on, lots of feelings, instead of looking down and doing the math. So on a $500,000 house, if you're going to put 3% down on your first home, and you're looking at a $500,000, putting down the 3%, that's 15 grand. The odds of you finding a place to rent for $1,200 a month are pretty slim to none in this market, correct? So I think it's pretty apparent, like, hey, so there's a couple different things you can do. You can get a side hustle job. I worked 3 jobs when I was, only one of them I could use to qualify, but I worked 3 jobs to be able to save up money. The other is staying at home longer. I know a lot of people are staying at home longer. That's great. Well, then don't spend that money out at the clubs and the bars. Put that money in the bank so that you can ultimately go buy a house. And I think understanding the lost revenue, the lost opportunity in it, meaning to save up $100,000 took me most of my life to save up 100 grand in cash. And that's a monumental moment for me, from being bankrupt to saving that first 100 grand. Like I'm definitely not a money like math guru, but for me to be able to make 100, 200 grand on real estate just had to do with me making a payment for 2.5 or 3 years that I had to make anyways, whether it was going to be somebody else's mortgage or my own. And so I think that's just really, you can have reasons or results, you can have excuses, or you can, have your house. I think it's just sitting down, looking at the data and coming up with the solution for it. But just throwing your hands in the air and paying somebody else's mortgage, or, that you're not getting any tax benefit, you're not sharing in any of the equity of the house, you're just paying off somebody else's mortgage for them, and it's not necessarily going to be cheaper, I think is just, people are just looking at it the wrong way instead of looking at the data themselves. I could usually break down the data and prove it, and whatever their situation is, and really show them that they can get there. Maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's 2 years, but if someone really takes the time to consult them and give them the path for home ownership, anyone can get there, in my opinion.
Yeah, actually the first module that we go through in the First Home IQ curriculum is all about the psychology of money and your relationship to it. And to Dave's point earlier, I had a lot of personal anxiety about whether it was a good idea for me to buy in LA, because it just felt like it was a totally crazy market. But once I actually looked at the data and got logical with that information and took away that, or it did take away that anxiety so that I could see things clearly. And so, I really love the way that you're talking about that. And that I think for so many, if we could put that data in front of people as much as possible, that allows people to see what it means for them, not just like, oh, it's a good idea to buy, I'm going to dismiss that information, without having that personalized data.
Yeah, no, I think that's the biggest thing too.
And before we move on with your schedule or with your story, because I do want to play out kind of the different steps. Chris and I, because we're paying attention to First Home IQ. We saw what is it? A podcast. It was out by the New York Times, and it was titled "Should You Rent or Buy? The New Math." And I would tell you it was definitely not advocating for home ownership. If anything, it was giving people reasons to feel good about renting and helping support the narrative that I have it tougher, and maybe I should wait until rates come down to buy. I mean, that was what, by the way, would that be fair characteristic that they were like making you feel better, like don't worry about it. And when rates come down, like they're at 7%, wait till rates come down and then come and get it. Is that your takeaway from the podcast, Kristen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just, it was showing people the other part of that was that you can invest in the stock market while you can't afford home ownership right now. And maybe that's a better decision for you. And I don't, I mean, we've talked about this. I don't think that everything they said was necessarily wrong or bad, but it was so one-sided, focused on, continue renting while rates are high, and then you can do this down the
and invest. Yeah, I would say that was the influence, so two questions with that. They also brought up that, hey, if you buy a home, and they're kind of making the comparison that when you pay rent, you're wasting money. And when you buy a home, there's some money that you're wasting. And they actually called out real estate commissions in that. And every time they were, kind of packaging something under wasting money, in my mind, I was like, no, you're investing in what real estate that will create wealth over time. Like it shouldn't even be characterized as wasting money. It's all about investing money when you really go towards real estate. What are your thoughts to that whole type of thinking?
For me, so I'm 60% in equities, stock market, and I'm 40% in real estate for my entire portfolio. So I love dollar cost averaging. I love the S&P 500, but I also love real estate because it uses a lot less of my money. So when I invest in the stock market and I throw in $100, I only make the upside on the $100 that I put in it. In real estate, I can put in $100 and I make the upside on the $500,000 investment or whatever that is, depending on the amount of that people are putting down. So, I mean, there are down payment assistance programs where people don't have to really put any money down or a very small amount, and then they get the entire upside on the larger real estate asset. I always find it funny, most of those articles, you do the research, most of those people actually own homes. They're great to get people's attention, which is why people write those articles. But wealth is built through real estate. The economy's backbone is real estate and construction, and always has been. And so when you look at the most wealthy people, most importantly, it's great because when rates are high, there are less people buying, which allows us investors to go in there and buy as many of these properties at discount, so that when rates drop and everyone else starts coming in and buying, they bid the properties up very quickly. And then we get the upside 20–30% on those properties as they immediately go up very quickly. Because, you want to pay $1. Now Dave wants to pay $2. Kristen says 3. Dave says 4, 5, 6, and it just keeps going up. Meanwhile, I bought it for 50 cents and I just sit here and wait for you guys to bid it up. And then I can sell that asset or hold on to it. Real estate, I've always looked at it, same as you said, Dave, it's a buy and hold investment for the most part. When you start getting into flips and things like that, it definitely gets a little bit more complicated. You got to know what you're doing, but it's a buy and hold investment. If you buy it and hold it today, 20, 30 years from now, you're going to make a really good return on that investment.
All right. So I want to level set a couple things. So for Gen Z that's watching this, and again, if you're a mortgage professional, we really are doing this interview so that it inspires and helps mortgage and real estate professionals. It inspires them and pushes them to become ambassadors like JJ is. He's an ambassador of FirstHomeIQ, which JJ, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
For any Gen Z that's watching this, we're interviewing someone that has become wealthy. I mean, you've heard his story of the humble beginnings that he started at and the first home. And now you're going to hear about the second home, the third home, and whatever you're willing to share of what you've accomplished. Again, being a loan officer, being a leader of loan officers, being an investor in real estate, being an investor in the stock market. Finish the story, and then we'll share the takeaways.
Yeah, you bet. So I love the parlay of it, right? So ultimately, when it came to the personal real estate assets, for the most part, maybe I've always leveraged one into the other. So after that condo, I sold that and bought a single family home for I think it was $420,000. And it was a little bit of a fixer upper. So I got the thing fixed up and had my first child there. My wife and I, that was our first house when I proposed to her. And then we had sold that house for $685,000. These houses are all, I'm sure they're worth way more now, but that was in the early 2000s. And keep in mind, 9/11 happened, which wasn't a really great time. I mean, the .com happened when I had that other condo. There's always been some sort of economic struggle or something that had happened. And you just kind of make and ride your way through because you need a place to live anyway. So, and then we had then gone out to Arizona where I had taken a job and lived there for about a year and then bought another house out there. And that's where things didn't go well. Right then was I'd gone out there to open a mortgage branch and the market crashed and I was stuck. I had bought a beautiful home. I think we paid $815 for that property, but it was zero down. So at this point I was able to take all the cash out of the homes that I had made, zero down on the next house. And then the bottom fell out in 08, 09, and we were completed with bankruptcy in 09. Not something that I'm proud of, but not something I'm ashamed of. I didn't know any better. Again, my dad was not someone who counseled on money, and nor did they teach this in public schools or even private schools. And so, yeah, when we lost that house, it was hard. We were able to move back to California quickly, and I was able to buy a house. At that time, there were different rules and regulations and stuff. So I was able to get in another home shortly after that. And that was a much tinier house. It was like maybe 1,000 square feet, but man, it was good enough for me and my family. And it sure humbled me. And I learned things pretty quickly about, what I should be doing and not be doing, especially with the baby on the way, a new marriage and a 2-year-old. And then we purchased that house for what was it? I think $425. Again, going backwards, right? But I was more scared about being broke, and I already knew if I had to pay rent to somebody, I'd rather pay it to myself than to somebody else. And I used a down payment assistance program for that home as well. And then that home we had sold for the next for $625 is what we sold that for. And then took that equity and then bought our next home that we loved for $715. And that was our forever home. And my wife always jokes, I tell her it's never the home, honey, it's just the next home. And so that house, we loved it. It was perfect. It was beautiful. And that's now a rental property that we've turned into a rental. And that property is now worth about, when I looked it up, about $1.3 million. So it sits there. That's our forever home in California, where we would probably come to, but that's an investment property now. And then we leveraged that and bought our dream home again, up in San Juan Capistrano, Ocean View, the next big home. And that one we were able to parlay. And I bought that house for $1.3 million and sold that house for just above $2 million before we moved to North Carolina. So you can see the trend here. And this is through good times and through bad times. The one thing I could say that I've always done is I didn't have an anxiety. My anxiety and fear of having to be broke and save the money on my own, because I realized how hard it was to earn it and save it, especially living in California, than it was to invest it and use leveraged investments to be able to get that money. As you guys could see from house to house, inherently, and keep in mind, I've made some really great money and I could save some really great money, but it's still the rate of which I could save it compared to the rate of the appreciation on the homes that I bought. It was one, easier, and two, much faster.
Two words I hope everybody wrote down: parlay. Did you notice how he's always parlaying it into the next home? Which, again, not for everyone. We're not here to advocate that everyone needs to have $1 million home. I mean, JJ, he's going to tell you well, I don't know if he's going to tell you the value of the home he lives in now, but I mean, he's wealthy. He's built generational wealth that will help his family have wealth. But he used leverage, parlay, and then courage. Like it is. I remember when I bought my first home. I mean, I can still remember like being in the shower, sitting down, and just like feeling stressed out about the process. And I was in mortgage, when I bought my second home, and my wife and I moved up. I remember just like, I mean, it's intense, the emotions. So for every Gen Z that has a lot of anxiety around this, guys, you're going to have anxiety around it. We're not going to solve that. But if you want to live your life's purpose, how you manage anxiety, how you overcome anxiety is going to have a lot to do with the happiness that you achieve in life and the success that you achieve in life. And I do truly believe that, somewhere along the line, don't know what age it is for you if you're listening to this, but home ownership is how you're going to own your future. So JJ, just net it out, and then we're going to bring Kristen in, and she's going to, bring the spirit of a millennial and a Gen Z and a skeptical mind around this, and then we'll wrap it up. So where are you at today? Like, whatever you're willing to share.
Yeah, I mean, so we ended up going to North Carolina. So sold that beautiful Ocean View house, and medium housing price here in Orange County is about $1.2 million. So it's all relative to where you're at. But for me to be able to be here where my business is, and then we moved to North Carolina for a couple of years. So sold that house, did really well on that. Moved to North Carolina, bought a house, thought that was going to be our forever place, and then again, it wasn't the house, it was just the next house. And I say this because life happens. And I think, people just need to understand that life happens. And I don't want them to be afraid to make that next step. And so we bought a beautiful place in North Carolina, and then parlayed that back to come here to California, which is where I live now. And then since then, we've bought some other properties for short-term rental investments. One of them was right before COVID. We put down $30,000 on this beautiful house in Winter Park, and it's still not done yet. It's supposed to be done next month. And the recent comp just sold next door for 2.4. So literally it's gone up $1 million, and I invested 30,000. So I could flip that and put it on the market. So I use these numbers and examples because they sound outrageous and ridiculous. And I think they are, and it's amazing because you can only get that type of stuff through real estate. And I gave examples of how they didn't go so well and how well I was left with having to leave a house. So, I mean, but at the end of the day, the common denominator is I needed a place to live. Like I needed a place to live. And I learned by spending all of my equity to not do that, not over leverage myself. These homes all have equity in them. And I think it's important to live within your means. And for us being in the mortgage space forever, Dave, it's like we're commission employees. I haven't had a steady paycheck since 2002. It's, you eat what you kill, and that's just how our industry works. And I think there is some courage in that. But I think for folks that are out there that are skeptical, man, when you have that steady job, that steady paycheck, and you need a roof over your head, you just can't do anything else except just consult someone who's going to really sit down and show you how it is to buy a house.
So my last ask, and then Kristen jump in here, is I would love it if you created a total cost analysis that would go along with this interview and really design it for that first time home buyer. And since you used the number 500,000 or whatever you think the right number is, that would help people throughout the country make the decision to buy their first home, go from renting, make a MortgageCoach rent versus own analysis. And then if you don't mind, add a video to it that is just your message, like a little 3-minute message to Gen Z around homeownership. Like walk them through this rent versus own analysis. We'll call it the JJ Mazzo rent versus own for FirstHomeIQ. And it would be you advocating to own their future with real estate. You cool with putting that together sometime in the next couple of days to a week?
Yeah, no problem, buddy. I'd be honored to. Absolutely.
So he's all yours, Kristen.
Okay, we will share that in our First Home IQ newsletter and in Circle. So very excited to get that. Okay, so very related. One of the questions that I think a lot of people have, and kind of back to our conversation earlier, is that you have a certain amount of money that you've saved or whatever, and do I put that towards a down payment or do I put that in the stock market? And when you look at some of those comparisons, like there's a lot of costs associated with homeownership that people get overwhelmed by. I got very overwhelmed by this idea of having the HOA fee plus insurance and property taxes and your home maintenance costs and all of that. So whenever you're talking to someone today that is feeling overwhelmed by, what are all of the costs associated with buying this home, and rates are at, this higher level than what I know they were before, why, can you explain, I guess, a little bit more as to how you evaluate that? Do I put this money in the stock market versus putting this money in something that's appreciating at a rate that seems lower than the stock market, and I have all these costs associated with it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. So I think first question you have to ask yourself is, do I have my own primary residence? If you don't, then you should look at how much you have in reserves for survival money. So I believe everyone should have 3 to 6 months survival money reserve in their account, meaning, if your total outgo, including your new mortgage, is $5,000, you should have between $15,000 and $30,000 in an account, high interest yield savings, so that it's there. That's in case of an emergency. You lose your job, but let's be honest, if you lose your job and you spend 8 hours a day finding a new job, you'll probably find a new job in about 3 to 6 months, I would think. I don't know that everyone spends 8 hours a day doing that, but I would probably do that if I were in that scenario. So that gives you that cushion to not be afraid. So assuming that you have that cushion there, and you have the money to be able to also go buy your first home, and you don't have a first home, you should absolutely do that before getting into the stock market itself, in my opinion. And when it comes to the costs associated with it, you have to ask yourself, are you okay with, I would ask yourself, like, are you okay with getting 5 to 7% appreciation on the total home value of the home, total purchase price of the home? So if that's a $500,000 house, are you okay with collecting the $25,000 to $40,000 in appreciation each year? In which case, what's your answer going to be, Kristen?
Yeah, I'm pretty good with that.
Cool. So are you okay with paying the extra $10,000 or $15,000 it is the first year to be able to have access to that on average every single year thereafter? And the answer is probably going to be the same thing. So nothing ventured, nothing gained. It is an investment. You do have to invest some time. You do have to invest some money in it. But the long term is the fact, when you're renting, you're going to get no return on the investment, and you're going to pay 100% interest rate, and you're not going to have any tax benefits at all. And by the time you want to jump in, everybody else wants to jump in with you, and you've missed out on a large part of that appreciation also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting hearing you talk about the appreciation of the, home value versus the appreciation of just the amount of money that you put in. And that's the comparison I hadn't really thought about, I guess, or articulated. So that's really great.
Yeah, that's the biggest difference between the stock market. And I love the stock market. The compounding interest is an amazing thing. But, again, if you need a roof over your head, that should be number one. Get a roof over your head, that you're paying down the mortgage, that you're getting the appreciation, not somebody else. Then you can go into the stock market.
And to be clear, I mean, with First Home IQ, as you know, we are very focused on a holistic, health of your finances, and that includes investing and all that. But we want to make sure that that people are, as we talked about earlier, approaching this with data that makes sense for them, that they're really clear-minded about what is available to them through homeownership and through investing in other areas. So that's great. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, you bet. And if they're already renting, they're already paying a mortgage. It's just somebody else's. So it's not that far off from where they need to go.
Yeah.
So JJ, I mean, in my day job at Trust Engine, we're building technology to help, loan officers become mortgage advisors so they can really give advice. But, the First Home IQ mission is to reverse the trend, empower, inspire, and educate Gen Z so that they can own their future younger and faster. Why have you embraced this? Because you've really embraced it. You've invested both your time and money in First Home IQ. Do you mind just kind of sharing your personal why?
Well, it changed my life. My dad passed away last year, 89 years old, and he didn't have a penny to his name. And my parents, they bought that house, they sold it, they got divorced, they sold it and split the money, and they never bought again. And that money was all gone. So I think for me, it's just from a place of the past and wanting to help other people avoid that, because I got fortunate enough where I had some really great mentors, some people that understood this stuff, that took the time to teach it to me. And had I not listened, obviously, I wouldn't be in this scenario, but I sure as heck wouldn't have been in this scenario had someone not taken the time to teach it to me. And so I think it's paying it forward. I think it's an obligation. And if I don't do that, then it's self-serving, and nothing good comes out of that, honestly. And if I can help someone else avoid, getting stuck in their own cycle, I could have just as easily been stuck in my own family's financial cycle instead of breaking that cycle for my future generations. If I can have a little piece of doing that, man, all day long. And that's why when we first talked about this, it was like, this is a no-brainer for me. This is why I got in the mortgage business, to help people get into houses for this very reason. So to be able to teach young people, this is like a dream for me, man. It fills my cup and purpose.
No, bro, you seriously, man, I just can't thank you enough, man. You inspire me. Hopefully the mortgage and real estate professionals that listen to this got some value and inspiration. Hopefully we actually get some Gen Z young folks listening to this who haven't achieved home ownership, and this pushes you guys to do it. So if you're watching this at our YouTube channel, there'll be a link to the actual total cost analysis. He'll put the numbers in place, like, hey, renting, this is what that looks like on a monthly level. Here's a couple different, purchase option strategies, what that looks like monthly. And then the most important thing is, what does that look like in 3 years? What does that look like in 5 years? What does that look like in 15 years? That's how you make informed decisions. So super grateful. Kristen, any closing thoughts before we wrap it?
Gosh, I'm just so inspired, not just by your story, but your passion and mission around this. So thank you so much for sharing. And we'll definitely post this, not just in the First Home IQ communities, but also in our curriculum, because I think this information is exactly the kind of stuff that we want to be sharing with the next generation. So.
No, thank you guys so much. I was super honored and just grateful you guys even asked, and I could be a little part to help you guys out. Thank you.
Well, thank you, my brother. Well, have an awesome day. I look forward to the next time on Zoom with you.